We need to support responsibility to protect as a concept because it is the fundamental structure through which we can prevent mass atrocities. The responsibility to protect doctrine is many things, but primarily it's a program or a structure that's developed to protect civilians, citizens from mass atrocity crimes like war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and so on. If there are mass atrocities, genocide, such as happened in Rwanda, and so on, the international community has a responsibility to do what it can to alleviate the crisis, to prevent mass killings, and so on, under that umbrella grouping of mass atrocity. So if there is nothing available, then there needs to be something developed so that action can take place. As you know, R2P has been referenced many times within the UN and including at the Security Council level. So if we see R2P as an authority directed at resolving crises, we can say that the UN has taken up the idea. Has it been implemented in the sense that crises have been blocked? In some cases, I think we can say that's the case. But the problem is we're developing a new norm within the context of old ways. So if we were to take an example such as the UN intervention in Libya, I think there's many things we can say about that. One is it was correct for the UN and the Security Council to draw attention and to become animated over the threat that was taking place in that country, in Benghazi in particular, but not just in that area. And to propose that the government there, Gaddafi's government, has a primary responsibility to stop atrocities or the threat of atrocities. And if he is unsuccessful in doing that, or if he is actually behind some of that activity, then the international community should get involved. So what happened was the resolution that was written regarding Libya was a bit vague. It can be argued that it was intentionally vague or that it was naively vague, but it left the door open for many different options to resolve the crisis. And I would argue because of that ambiguity, NATO was given a free rein and carried out activity that was in violation of the spirit, at least, of that resolution. So you can say that R2P was implemented there and in other places, several other places. In fact, I think there's something like 47 UN Security Council references to R2P since the beginning, and most of those after Libya. So it's not as if the situation in Libya or the failings in Libya have put an end to R2P as a concept. R2P is healthy in the sense of discussion continuing. The principle of non-intervention, which is a concept embraced by the UN and UN Charter, the Charter of the UN does not only support the non-intervention premise. States within the UN do have protection under the Charter from aggression, from large states using their weight against them, and so the Westphalian concept of state security is defended. However, the UN Charter also defends human rights, and so there's a balance that takes place between states having their own realm that they have control of, and citizens within those states having protection as well. So what R2P says, which is not entirely new, because the Charter, it can be shown, also says the same thing, is that there is an obligation of states to protect their own citizens. To that extent, they have free rein within their state. But if there are violations at the level of mass atrocities, then the international community is given the right through the Security Council, using Chapter 7 of the Charter, to respond, to intervene in one way or the other, either with support for the government which requires help, with help from other states with that government, or in the cases where the government in question is the cause of violations of human rights, then the international community can respond and cross borders if given permission by the Security Council to do so in a resolution. R2P as a norm is an idea. It's not a part of the UN Charter. It's not a phrase within the UN Charter. It's consistent with the UN Charter, and it's arguably only consistent if authority for promoted actions under that umbrella of R2P are given authority by the UN Security Council. So if we ask ourselves how R2P can be enforced, if there's resistance to the norm being advocated, for instance, protections of civilians in a crisis such as, let's say, within Syria. I mean, 300,000 people have been killed in Syria. We could attach the blame to the regime there, Assad's regime. We can attach the blame to rebels. We can attach the blame to interventions, military and otherwise, from states in the area. R2P is concerned with protection of civilians. R2P doesn't actually care who is responsible for the crimes and the atrocities that are taking place. The idea is to stop them. So the process required is still going through the UN Security Council resolution. So if there is among the, let's say, 5 permanent members of the Security Council a resistance because of an allegiance to the regime, let's say, that's being questioned, let's say Russia's support for Assad, for instance, that doesn't change, practically speaking, the steps we have to go through to enforce R2P. We still have to go through the Security Council. If Russia is vetoing a resolution, it means the resolution has to be adjusted to the extent that Russia will support it, assuming that the other 4 members of the Permanent 5 and the 15 members of the Security Council in a majority are in favor of the resolution. So what that would tell us is that in the Syrian situation, we need to go back and say, well, why is Russia objecting? The primary objection from Russia is that the interest in the U.S. and others to remove Assad from power as part of this deal. Now, there's been some sort of stepping back from that position, but that should tell us that there may need to be an adjustment of the resolution in the interests of protection of civilians to stop the bloodshed. So, to a certain extent, the R2P process is in play right now. I mean, the fact that there's no intervention, no military intervention, which is what most people see R2P as, which is a false generalization of what R2P is. It's also about prevention. It's about peace building. It's about fixing problems after intervention. But even on the intervention side, it's not necessarily about military intervention. It could be about police. It could be about peacekeeping. It could be about diplomatic channels being opened up. and so on. The goal of all of this is to prevent genocide or mass atrocities, war crimes, and so on. So that's how we implement the R2P, because R2P is not really anything new in the sense of what the UN and the UN Charter allows us to do. We still have to use proper means. We still have to use proper authority. We have to have our goals and rules of engagement in place, and so on. So I'm involved primarily at the discussion stage and advocating for a norm and developing ways of looking at it so that problems or questions raised about it can be resolved. And I mean, there are legitimate questions about how R2P has been implemented. Let's say, take Libya, for instance. You know, I certainly supported the resolution on Libya, but at the point where there were news reports about the arms embargo being one-sided, that instantly raised questions in my head. You know, something is up here. This isn't a neutral structure anymore. This is now, it seems to be moving in the direction of removing Gaddafi, supporting, you know, one side of a conflict, and not only preventing mass atrocities from taking place. So there were things that could have been done that weren't done. There were things that were done that shouldn't have been done. So that kind of conversation is where I'm involved in and not being afraid to raise questions, you know, often uncomfortable questions about a doctrine or an idea that I support strongly. I think when we look at R2P as to its role and whether it fills a gap in the global governance understanding, we have to ask what is new about R2P and what isn't new. I mean, both questions are valid. R2P is new in the sense that since the end of the Cold War, we've now begun a conversation that says it is no longer acceptable, if it ever was, for mass atrocities to take place. So that's new, and it's possible to have that conversation because at the Security Council level, there was the beginning of a conversation between the major powers that were no longer divided in the old Cold War ways. And so there was an opportunity to now talk about stopping atrocities. And so there were higher interests, humanitarian interests that rose. What's not new about R2P are the charter requirements for the kind of activities that are needed in order to intervene or prevent or rebuild a society that's in conflict with mass atrocities at the head. So there's that contradiction between wanting to show R2P as being something brand new, which it isn't. It's a new conversation. It's a new way of looking at problems that have been around for a long time. So in the past, the UN has developed a structure through the Charter for addressing major world problems. So we need to get the idea from out of the hands of diplomats and strategists and bureaucracies and governance people, so that when people see an atrocity or a war crime in process, they begin to think, you know, are there mechanisms to alleviate this? How would we do it? What's the capacity? You know, is there a UN force capacity that's available? Is the Security Council doing its job? Is there balance in the discussion? So What's needed now is for the R2P idea to be widely understood, at least at its kernel level. I mean, there are many aspects to R2P as an idea, but the fundamental ones are straightforward. They are prevention of atrocities, mass atrocities, and using proper mechanisms to do that, so that it's not ad hoc. So it's not major powers taking advantage of small powers, and it's not about protecting dictatorships because we're afraid that state security limits have been breached, have been violated, and that would be the end of the system that we've developed at the UN. It's a compromise, and it's also a question of principle. It's a question of morality, and I think on those levels, many people would support the concept if they understood it better, and that's where we need to go. We need to make it so that it's comprehensible and straightforward to understand.